So now we're going to go into the workshop situation that I had shared with you before, and Dr. John Waddell will be leading this session, so I'm going to have John come up here in a second, but this is, what we've titled it is Don't Fear the Future, a discussion about the challenges and opportunities ahead. So that will be our topic, and we want to gain some feedback from all of you relative to what you see as the future challenges and opportunities that we have. So that will be the point of the discussion. So John, I'll turn it over to you and have you take this session.
Thank you, Bill. Mic number 2. Maybe I don't need one. There we go. All right, so I think this is the best part of the day. And anytime you get a chance to actually stump Jim Lowe, this is an awesome exercise. So I want to invite our panelists forward, and really pleased to first Dr. Jim Lowe, and he is now an associate professor and head of the IFAMS program at University of Illinois. He was an Illinois grad back in 1994.
I have an assigned seat, John.
You take it. You get first choice. So you guys all know Jim, and he's always been a forward thinker. And so I expect big things out of him today. Next is Dave Bomgaars from Orange City, Iowa. Dave is a veterinarian and through the years has developed a really successful finishing operation in Northwest Iowa, and one of the great thinkers and industry leaders. And last, you've already met Bill Davis, and Bill is again our legislative or regulatory affairs, government affairs director.
Government affairs works.
Government affairs, yep. So we kick this off with questions. I think I could start off, and I'm
John, I want all the hard questions to go to Dave because he brought references with him.
I figured with you I'd have to check up on you, see if you were
check
right.
out what stories I'm making up today.
Actually, I'm going to go right to you, Jim.
Oh, come on.
First question.
John, I said you had to tell jokes.
You can do
And I told him I was the joke. So, in 2010, almost 10 years ago now, you presented at the AASV keynote address, the Dunn Lecture, and your title was People, Processes, and Pigs. Are we fixing what is really broken? And I'm going to ask you, what was broken, and have we fixed what was broken? And what is still broken?
That's a long time ago, John. I've gotten significantly older since then. Well, I think the point of that discussion was, right, that we often tend to focus on short-term things that pop up in our face and not really the underlying system that is functioning inappropriately. So we're working on symptoms instead of actually the actual disease that's occurring in the system. And that disease is often two-legged and not four-legged, right? So I don't think that's particularly changed in the industry today. I guess my perception is that 98% of our disease issues are two-legged, and there's occasionally four-legged problems, but most of those are either how we design the system or how we operate the system, or probably more importantly, how we measure the system. And what are we measuring, and is it really the things that drive business profitability, or are we chasing intermediate measures, et cetera? And so then we start making crazy decisions. I thought Nick's stuff today was fantastic, right? Because it is, I guess I've been a big decision maker. I like to make decisions, and I tend to make a lot of them. And it is about, right, my phrase with guys that I'm trying to lead, and I've gotten into the university, and it's been a really interesting process because it's sclerotic, and we hate making decisions because we don't want to decide what we're not going to do, and I think we still struggle with that as an industry. What are we not going to do, and then how do we let one decision drive the next? And we tend to let one decision, we get married to it, the sunk cost of the decision drives it. And I don't think it's changed in 10 years, I guess would be my commentary.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Right. Dr. Bomgaars, what do you see as the industry's significant pain points right now? I mean, we often hear labor is always a significant issue, and if that is the case, then what are we doing, and what can we do to reduce that pain point of labor on pig farms?
Yeah, I definitely agree that labor is a huge point, not financially the driver the end result. There's a lot bigger factors, but from a day-to-day operation, being in the barn, having the job done right, having trained labor that stays around is definitely a key to having numbers that look acceptable in your performance. I think it was Kim Reynolds, governor of Iowa, who has a Focus Ready Iowa initiative that is going to spend, I don't know if it's 12 million, but it's going to be a large amount to sponsor mentorships, training for the new workforce. And I think that's all good. However, the new workforce in one industry, like say the packing plant, I mean, they're going to have to run around with maintenance, not with a screwdriver, but with a laptop to control the robotic saws that cut, the carcasses. So I think that's still going to require apprenticeships. It's going to require leadership. I think this room is filled with people who could fill a huge role in the leadership and creating an environment for the people who are working within the system that they're proud of the job. I look at some of the jobs we are looking to hire for, and sometimes we compete with bankers. There's probably some bankers in the room. But it's pretty hard to compete against a bank with a corner office that gets to play a four-man best ball every 2 weeks. So we've got to create something that attracts them, from redesign of buildings to have more space, more light, better ventilation. What have we really changed in ventilation, really? I mean, we still have an environment that is not ideal for people to walk in. So I think there's a lot of things I could ramble. I'll stop with that, but that's a little introduction to some of the things I see.
So planting some seeds. So Bill really enjoyed your talk, and that's always a hot topic. What do we do with, how do we interact in that environment? And how can the people in this room how can they become more active and impact those issues that you deal with every day?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think there are a number of different things that you can do on a daily basis to help drive some of the issues that I highlighted in my presentation, and I'm sure the many issues that I didn't highlight in my presentation, but are extremely important to the work that you're doing every day. Get involved with some of the associations, whether you're looking at National Pork Producers or the Swine Vets or AVMA, and those groups on the national level do a great job of getting folks involved, getting folks to DC, up on Capitol Hill, meeting with lawmakers, influencers, their staff, and then they also have associations on the state side too, and some of you may be involved in some of these groups, state level pork groups or veterinary groups. If you're not, I would highly encourage you to get involved with them. They, again, do a great job of pushing those messaging every single day, but from someone who's based in DC and spend a majority of my time interacting with lawmakers and with their staff, what really moves the needle is when folks like you come into town and you talk and you tell your story about how these issues are actually impacting you. That's what really drives some of these issues. That's what moves the needle with legislators. So if you're not involved, I would highly encourage you to get involved with those groups. Go to town halls, meet with your lawmakers, meet with their staffs when they're back home in the district. I really can't emphasize it enough. It does make a difference. And I know it's time out of the day to go to DC and to travel there or to go to your capital, but all of these issues that are going on that are extremely important, and there's quite a few of them. Stories of how it impacts you on a daily basis is what actually really moves the needle on that.
Thank you. I know Jim McKean used to tell me when we were battling some of the antibiotic battles back in the 80s and 90s, he used to say, advocacy is not a spectator sport.
Yeah.
You've got to get on the field and mix it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Any questions pop up yet from the audience? Any burning questions so far? I did get one by text earlier today, and it's about how our industry has become so dependent on exports, and of course that isn't always the best model, right? If you're at risk of losing a big chunk of your production to exports, to restrictions. And so besides foreign animal diseases and all the things we put in place to, to keep them out and protect our national herd, what are some of the other bigger controllable risks that we can implement?
I'll address that briefly. I was thinking about that earlier today, and I remember an NPIC meeting about 5 years ago, and there was a panel talking about 28% exports and how great that is, and it's going to increase the demand. Now, in some respects, that is good. I mean, you're working to increase demand around the world, but we also need to be aware of the dependency that puts on exports as well. And we have to look at, I think it was earlier Nick mentioned a three-legged stool, and a lot of you probably use that. We use it to diversify how we purchase pigs. Some are sow units ownership, some unit 2 to 3 year agreements, some spot market purchases. We look at our marketing agreements. Some are cutout based, some are 212, some are some other formula. But I think we need to also look at that on the market in general and the global factors that affect what we get for our pig. Because the last 6 months have been a tremendous drain and erosion on the equity and working capital, as we haven't had quite what we thought. And as a result, we've got $46 pigs and break-evens of 65 to 70. And it has created an increased demand for a while. We met it. We're going to meet the demand. But it also does put a risk to it that we need to be aware of. The panel at that time said, there's no risk in that, don't worry about it. Well, there's a lot of people today who are pretty worried about it. And some of those bankers I mentioned are worried about it. So I think we need to diversify our market. We need a three-legged stool of several things. When we do need to go and find out what our customers around the world and domestically, I think we could do a lot more on maybe just kind of getting into the minds of how to maximize the marketability and the attractiveness of pork. I have just this week, yesterday, I was at a restaurant with a medical doctor out of California. Good friend of mine happened to be in the area, and I met him for lunch. And we talked about pork, and he still thought you had to cook it well done. Medical doctor, very intelligent, tremendously successful. We can say we've told him 1,000,000 times, but we haven't taught him. So I think we have so much more about different cuts and different niche markets that we have here that we need to put our collective brains together and try to get somewhere with it, because we haven't succeeded yet. We haven't maximized the U.S. market. So I think that's one thing that can help at least buffer the times when we have political issues that result in a 30 to 40% reduction in returns.
And John, I guess I'd look at it and say, I think we have to really rethink the production system. Because, right, we've continued to stay in this commodity mode where the game is turn the spigot on and run the spigot as hard as you can run the spigot on the game of diluting fixed cost. And is that really the model we can continue to be in? And is that a sustainable model long term in terms of, can we build the spec, can we build the order, can we do some other things in terms of re-engineering the process so that that fixed cost continues to be a lower percentage, right, of our total cost. We figured out how to beat that down, and yet we get so bloody concerned about diluting fixed costs that we don't necessarily say, are we actually optimizing dollars within the chain, and how do we create value? So that part of that's cooking day, part of that's who's the customer, part of that, what do they actually need? If you look at some of the dollars on total dollars at retail per pig, right, that number's been really static for a long time, but the percentage returning to the farm gate is highly variable, and we're one of those big troughs today. And so I look at that and say, how is that an opportunity? We're in a highly sophisticated system that we continue to run, not a whole lot different than when we had pigs outside, right? We bred sows and we took what we got. So how do we engineer the system instead of reversing and looking at it the other way? And what technology can we apply? And how do we use data? And how do we use decision analytics to actually change how we operate the system?
Yeah, takes huge momentum changes, right, to change the way we do business in the swine industry. I was interested in Dell's little factoid about how we've increased productivity on the south side so much in a scant 30 years. And just recently, Successful Farming, Betsy Freeze had an article on Wendell Murphy, and he didn't own his first sow until 1979. And so I'll ask you guys, are we going to see as much change and as rapid change in the next 30, 40 years as what we've seen in the last 40?
One, yes, but I would, John, if you flip that, and I'll be the contrarian because I'm a cynic. If you look at this from the outside world, right, and you look at that and you say your productivity, your efficiency metric that you're using has doubled, right? We've doubled the output per sow, and yet we make less money as an industry. Maybe we're keeping score wrong, folks, right? I mean, who cares how many pigs per sow a year you make if you don't make any more money? And so, if you flip that around and say, do we really need to have a hard look about how we operate the industry, how we do it? What are we chasing? What are we trying to get done? Because I think it's going to flip, and I think data is going to drive that, right? I mean, I think if you just look at every other industry, and we'll always lag it, data is going to drive how we run the business, whether that's blockchain or big data or blah, 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 whatever the smarty pants come up with. But I think those things are going to drive the industry, and I think that change is going to continue to accelerate. But yes, we've become a whole lot more efficient, but our return on net invested capital probably isn't any better and probably is worse.
Right. And I'd add to that, I think we'll improve in a lot of ways, but not necessarily the numerical production data numbers. And maybe we shouldn't improve on those. Maybe we should look at genetic changes that are resistant to disease, that'll result in less antibiotic use that the world wants, that will result in a carcass that's juicier and maybe a little more flavorful, but the numbers won't be as good. But maybe the numerator can go up and we don't worry about the denominator quite so much, the cost. We look at the return side, and I think it's time to look at the return side and see what they want, rather than what we can produce cheap.
Well, pause again, and are there any questions? Yeah.
And a little bit of a question. The swine industry is not unique in the regard that we've driven profits out of our business over time as we've gotten larger systems, and where it's strictly a numbers game. How many pigs can I make out of so many sows every year? And we ignore the demand side of the equation, basically. And so, for example, when we had PED come through our country and essentially had forced reduction in pig numbers, what happens to the price? And the profits, they go through the roof. We have the most profitable year. Everybody says it's a miserable thing, I got PED, and yet if you look back at that, everybody says that's the best year in the last 15, 20 years for profits in the industry. Maybe what we need to stop doing is produce as many pigs as we can and start figuring out what the market wants and try to balance supply with demand. And the other comment I have is when you look internationally, no country, including ours, wants to buy food from somebody else. Fundamentally, people don't want to be dependent on somebody else for their food supply, whether it's China or Japan or us, or Europe, that we all want to have our own captive food supply because it's been used as a weapon at various times historically, and nobody wants to be in that position. So it's a fundamental problem we have from a governmental perspective in terms of how we handle food internationally. And it really is what I think our fundamental problem is in terms of having consistent demand over time. I'd like your take on that.
Sure. Well, I can jump in on it. I think your comments too on the PED where you saw some of the herd sizes grow going into that, a lot of that was based on some of the assumptions from the trade side of things. At that point in time, I think when you saw sizable growth, there was anticipation that TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was moving forward, and that was going to be an agreement that ultimately was going to move its way through Congress and ultimately be enacted, and that's given increased market access to major markets on the pork side, right? To the Japanese market, to the Vietnamese market, where I think right now, if I'm not mistaken, there's only about 2% of pork from the U.S. going over to the Vietnamese market, and they're consuming a lot of pork over there now. Incomes are rising in Vietnam, and they want product and they want it from the U.S. But of course, that deal obviously didn't come through, and it comes back to the point where you were making earlier, where there is a lot of dependency and expectations off of those export markets and markets that were going to be there in the future that right now aren't there. And of course, that's kind of spun into the climate that we are in right now, where not only are we not moving forward with some of those more bilateral or multilateral trade agreements, but we're having a hard time on the bilateral front as well. So I think it's a point well taken, but to the second part of your question too, where we're getting a little dependent on foreign markets, I agree with your point that we need to focus here more on the domestic market too. But we've got a lot of opportunities out there in the world. Examples like Vietnam, where we really don't have any market access right now, where we really can look to kind of increase some of our opportunities there. I mean, it's food stability, and that goes to foreign animal disease too. I completely agree, but I do think we need to keep an opportunistic eye towards some of those markets.
Anything else? Anybody else? Any other questions from the audience?
I was at the Iowa Vet Med Association Winter Conference earlier this year, and Dave Pyburn was there from the National Pork Board. He said they did a survey that if we would get African swine fever, regardless of their efforts to educate the consumer and say that the pork would be safe to eat, said 50% of the consumers would stop eating pork. So how do we address that? Because I think that's almost a bigger fear than losing the export market. So I don't know how we would address that other than how can we get out and better educate the consumers.
But if you look at the Eastern European model, that has happened, but that trend has been relatively short, so it's a few week period. I think if you look at ASF or any of the other foreign animal diseases, right, if you look at the damage that's being done to the European businesses, it's all collateral damage or indirect damage, not direct. I mean, there's very few farms, commercial farms that have been infected, but most of it is this market impact thing. And I think it just gets back to the point that I'm not sure anybody has got a big enough balance sheet to handle not selling 30% of the product. If you look at 25% of the product on an export basis, right? If there's a 3% or a 3-to-1 price elasticity ratio, we lose 3% of the market. We lose 25% of the market to 75% price reduction. Even for a short period of time, we're going to chew through a lot of equity, right? So I think those are I think it's these indirect concerns. If you look at stuff going on in Romania, look at stuff going on in Poland, in the Baltics, right? The hit has actually been not farms infected, but stop movement orders and really the restrictions on that. And I think you see the opposite consequence of that in China, where they've just said, heck with it, we're just going to move pigs wherever, and then they've drug it everywhere, right? But because of the concern over market prices. So I don't think if you just look at the European example, domestic demand is going to drop very long. There's certainly no evidence of that in any of the European stuff, but it's the export demand that's going to kill us.
Yeah, Iowa State did a great study looking at this. It wasn't particular to ASF, it was looking at FMD, but it took a look at over a 10-year period of time with a large-scale outbreak of FMD in the U.S. What would the impacts be to the pork industry, beef industry, poultry, dairy, corn, and soybeans? It was $200 billion over a 10-year period. And that was just looking at the loss of export markets, which I agree. I think the consumer demand will take a hit in the shorter term, but it's the longer-term export markets is really where the pain will be.
The other thing I think that might happen would be another level and wave of consolidation that makes the last 20 look fairly small, because there are not that many people who could stand that kind of hit. And in the last 5 years, if you look at profit margins, most of the profit margin has gone to the 48-hour ownership of meat, which is the packer, versus the 6-month or 10-month counting gestation of the producer. So I think it would have a huge impact on consolidation, and we'd see another wave of it.
Dr. Hawkins.
I think before we move on from this question, can we learn something what happened with Canada when mad cow disease hit? And they actually rallied Canadians to eat beef, to eat their way out of their export problem, because all that beef got backed up into Canada, and they literally ate their way out of it. You know, so I think there's something to be learned there. That's all I'm going to say. There's something to be learned there, that if something hits here and people are afraid of what happened, we turn it around and say, look, you got to help the industry. You got to help us get through this, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. And you've seen some of that start with groups like the National Pork Producers Council, who have started to promote more the consumption of the product. You know, as the industry's faced a lot more headwinds, you see a lot more promotional materials coming out on consuming pork. I think their initiative is Put Pork on Your Plate, is what they call it. So I think industry's starting to do some of those things, but it's certainly in an instance like this, it would have to be magnified.
So while we're on the ASF topic, so Bill, my first question is that because China is already positive for it, does that mean that is there a possibility of continuing to trade with them? So we might not have a 30% reduction if we could continue to trade with them, since we're both, if we were to break, we would both be positive. And my second question on the ASF front is, as I feel like with PD, we were horribly unprepared and it sort of just steamrolled through here. And I kind of have that same doom and gloom feeling about ASF. So what would your opinions be on what should we be doing, or what's our best practice to get prepared today that we're probably not doing?
Take the first part. Short answer is yes. I think there's opportunities to still trade with China, and we're starting to work through that right now. I mean, with the outbreak that they're having over there, I think China being the largest pig population in the world and potentially having culled about 25% of that at this point in time, there's going to be a need there, a demand that they're going to have that's going to be unmet. So I think there is potential opportunities to fill that. That said, it's all kind of caught up in a vacuum right now with these trade negotiations on a larger scale. And again, I would go back to the point that I had made a little bit during my presentation, where I think there could be an opportunity for bulk purchases of pork, but there could be some larger scale changes depending on how this continues to unfold within the Chinese market. But I do think there's opportunity there for it, absolutely.
So ASF spread, I'm with you, Deb. I continue to have this trepidation and shaking in my boots, and then you go look at the facts, and maybe that's not warranted even for a cynical fool like me. ASF is not PRRS, ASF is not PED. If you look at the transmission in Europe, we spent a fair amount of time looking at that, we meaning my PhD student. Let's be clear, I didn't actually do the work.
An extension.
Yeah, he's not here yet. He's still in an airplane, so I can say whatever, and he won't tell me I'm wrong. He'll be here in a few minutes. But in all honesty, right, the movement, and so just to deconstruct what's happened in Europe and China, nobody knows because the data's terrible. But where the reporting's been quite good in Europe, there are two things going on. The movement has primarily been in domestic pigs, and it's been almost exclusively within village pigs or small holding pigs, right? So there's all these pigs over Eastern Europe, they get moved a few at a time. The outbreak movement appears to be that it moves in domestic pigs. It takes big jumps in domestic pigs, probably through meat or the movement of pigs. If you've been to Eastern Europe, you realize they kind of move stuff around willy-nilly, don't really tell anybody. And then from there, it gets spread into wild boars. But if you actually look at the documented transmission for wild boars back into domestic swine, that appears to be somewhat infrequent. There also is not really sustained movement of the virus within within commercial pigs within Eastern Europe. So if you think about it as three populations, I've got commercial pigs, I've got these domestic village pigs, and I've got wild pigs. There is local spread within wild pigs. There is fairly large spread within domestic pigs because of garbage feeding and everything else. And then there's infrequent incursions into commercial swine populations. The virus does not move easily and does not even kind of move easily. And so even within some of these herds, they've been able to depopulate buildings within complexes and not spread it to the rest of the site. So it's taking weeks to move through 1,000-head finishing barns. It's not days. And so there's a very different pattern to that. And so the ability to control that and the ability to detect it. Now, our problem is, right, we got a lot of pigs with wheels underneath them every week that move really long directions, and if we're not on the switch, the other thing you have to remember is the virus is probably there for 2 weeks before you see clinical signs, and so we might be chasing our tail on this guy, Gizmo. If you look at the Spain-Portugal example, which is the only spot where they've cleaned it up, really simple biosecurity fixed it. Stop garbage feeding, put the pigs inside, don't let them mingle with outdoor pigs. They stop the outbreak there, and it just burns itself out in wild pigs fairly quickly. The ones that die are going to die, and the ones that are resistant live on, and transmission stops, right? The N isn't high enough to sustain it. So it's really, really different than the other ones. I could get really nervous about ASF in the US, like really nervous about ASF in the US, but if you actually look at what's going on in Eastern Europe, I'm not that concerned, except for every time I fly through O'Hare and I see the pile of stuff that gets pulled out. I'm not sure 60 Beagle teams are enough, like maybe 600 might be. I think they're off an order of magnitude. Literally, if you look at what's going to happen, I think that's probably our biggest risk. And if you look at what's happened in Eastern Europe, that's really clear what's happening. It's moving with meat product. They see disease, they butcher these pigs, they grind it up into sausage. There was one point in Romania you could not buy a freezer. I'm not exaggerating. There was not a freezer for purchase in the country last fall. It was prior to Christmas. There was ASF breaking in village pigs. They traditionally butcher those pigs prior to Christmas as part of the Christmas deal. It's very much a sociology project. They went to butcher those pigs. They started to see disease. They knew the government was going to take those pigs, and they just come in and start butchering pigs ahead of time. They put all that meat in the freezer and or put it into sausage, and they share it with their friends all over the place. So they've got ASF positive meat being distributed. So if you look at the lack of control in Romania, and Romania is an unmitigated disaster from ASF, it's this sociology issue, not the science issue or the pig issue that I think is really the problem. And so I'm nervous, Deb. I'm right. I've seen it, been there, been in the middle of it. You're ready to just go, God. But you start looking at it scientifically in the US as in Eastern Europe. We have a very different culture. I think we have a bit better control on what happens, and so maybe we're not lost.
I'll address that just briefly. I think about the risk being people that are sending product to their children who are in universities in Iowa, for example. Iowa University has a lot of students that originate from places where they have ASF. It only takes one piece of product that's contaminated that gets thrown out the window where they do happen to have a pig exposure. So I don't think the odds are high probably, but I am very concerned with it. But taking it the next step, once we've done all we can, we have the beagles and we have the feedstuffs, the quarantine timeframes, I think early detection, because we move 50 loads a day between feeder pigs and isolines and pigs to market. We need early detection. So what we're doing is we're using a technology that's an animal health platform where our producers, in an app called Every Pig, just put their postmortem results if we want it. They video their pigs, and we see all 350 sites pretty much every day. Not risking biosecurity by going out there, but by having somebody behind a screen seeing it. So I think quick identification is going to be key if we do get it, because it'll be everywhere quickly.
One more question?
This is going to be the question that stumps Dr. Lowe. You ready? No.
Bring it on.
How do you feel about ongoing surveillance of tissue at the universities or accredited labs for ASF, similar to what we have done with classical swine fever, because that slow rolling clinical signs, that slow rolling mortality sounds a lot like a PRRS nursery. And so with 1 million plus pigs on the road every day, should we be doing some sort of ongoing testing at the universities to make sure that, to Deb's point, that we're ahead of it and it doesn't blow through?
Clinically, it doesn't look like PRRS. It moves pretty slow, but they do turn bright pink and hot. It is a fever. I've not actually physically seen one, but certainly seen plenty of videos. They're a little nervous about letting you get close to them for some reason. Laura, I think the challenge is, right, it's a heck of a good question, because what's the diagnostic stream? Because I'm with Dave. There are 8,500 foreign students in Champaign. 5,800 of those are from mainland China. We have an employee in our office that's from mainland China. She went home from Chinese New Year and she shows up with food. Right? We'd had long talks about there will be no pork. I think that's our risk, right? I mean, we've got a fancy restaurant in Bloomington, which is 50 miles up the road, that there's a pig farm between us, that they raise their own pigs. They've talked to me. They raise their own, the restaurant raises its own pigs. Guess what they feed those pigs? Restaurant waste. It's the thing to do, right? There's a place north of town. I think that goes on all the time. Those are the problem is that's the unsurveilled stream, Laura, that I think is our big gap, that we don't. I'm less worried about our commercial pigs because it looks weird enough, everybody's going to get all excited. It's the, I don't know what it is, the pigs died and we go on stream that I think is nervous.
Great.